Good evening. I am Willis Gowdy, a member of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Iowa State. It is my pleasure to introduce an individual whose written works have served as a catalyst for attempts to redirect society in these United States. Michael Harrington, born in St. Louis in the 1920s, educated at Holy Cross, Yale, and the University of Chicago, claims his postgraduate university was staffed with the best men and women of the labor, civil rights, and socialist movements. This training varied from his involvement with the Catholic worker movement, where he helped feed and clothe Bowery derelicts, to living and working with Arkansas sharecroppers, Mexican-American migrant workers, and out-of-work miners in Appalachia. His experiences led to studies of American industry, social alienation, and industrialized poverty. In his first book, The Other America, Harrington contended that people still starve to death in the United States, that a quarter of our people manage to find food but do not have any money, that being poor is too often synonymous with being black. The points were so forcefully made that The Other America was brought to the attention of John F. Kennedy, then president. This work is considered to be the inspiration that sparked the war on poverty that emerged under the Johnson administration. Few of us gathered here can say that our writings have moved even ourselves, let alone a nation. Harrington has also authored books including The Accidental Century, Toward a Democratic Left, The Politics of Poverty, and On Socialism. It is my belief that Harrington's lecture, entitled The Politics of Poverty, plus the brief question and answer session that will follow, is particularly appropriate for two reasons. In the first place, the topic is timely. Wars with strong political overtones are being waged at home on poverty and abroad in Vietnam. The parallels are striking, since neither conflict has been won in a military sense, nor in the minds of the people. Yet the call for commitment of resources supporting unsuccessful efforts continues. The dimension of time also enters when one realizes that interest in poverty and its alleviation seems to be cyclical. It is quite possible that we are entering the downward trend, with the intensity of effort diminishing. A second important reason for stressing the political aspects of poverty concerns the region in which we live. 1970 figures vary. An Office of Economic Opportunity report, based on internal revenue statistics, indicates that approximately 20% of Iowa families fall below the so-called poverty line. Recently released census figures on reported income include about 10% below the guidelines. The concentration of two subpopulations in Iowa, the rural and the aged, both more likely to be poor, also argues for the topic. But of greater importance are the attitudes of the people that one constantly hears in this area. Not only ordinary citizens, but also those in positions of power claim that poverty does not exist in Iowa. How could it in a locale whose motto is a place to grow? A final note must be entered. I feel a deep personal debt to Michael Harrington. His works hold the rather dubious distinction of serving as a basic reference in the opening chapters of my doctoral dissertation. Michael Harrington.
You have no idea how old it makes a man feel to appear in a doctoral dissertation. But there you are. I don't want to give a stump speech tonight in the political campaign of 1972. I hope in what I will say that I will be partisan and frank and candid, but that I will say some things to you and suggest some ideas that will have value no matter who wins the election of 1972. But I think you would guess it from my speech. However, I feel in honesty that I must tell you that I am a passionate advocate of the retirement of Richard Nixon and the election of George McGovern. And what I will say, I won't try to be objective, but I will try to be fair. They are not the same thing. What I would like to do is to divide an analysis of the politics of poverty into three different areas. First of all, to talk about the situation in welfare, and particularly to take as a point of departure Mr. Nixon's Labor Day message of a few days ago. Secondly, to talk about a welfare program which is not as well known as the welfare program for the poor, that is to say the welfare program for the rich, which is considerably more expensive and generous. And finally, having analyzed welfare for the poor, which is pathetic, and welfare for the rich, which is princely, to suggest to you a political analysis, again trying to be relevant to 1972, but also to go beyond it, a political analysis of how this nation might go beyond this skewed set of priorities we have in which the rich are given so much more than the poor. So first of all, let me try to analyze the situation in welfare and take as my text for that part of my talk Richard Nixon's Labor Day message. Mr. Nixon, as you know, is a firm partisan of the Protestant ethic. The Protestant ethic need have nothing to do with Protestantism. It is that attitude, that theory associated really with the rise of capitalism, reflected in some Protestant theology, in which a man or a woman finds their worth in their own eyes, in the eyes of their neighbor, and in the eyes even of God, by doing hard, sweaty, miserable work. The more it hurts, the more virtuous it must be. And Mr. Nixon said in this Labor Day message, as he has said in every Labor Day message since he's been elected president, that work is basically good. That, I submit to you, is nonsense. Some work is basically good and some work is terrible, and may have to be born out of economic necessity, but it's not something anybody should celebrate. Stoop labor in the fields of California as a migrant farm worker is not ennobling. Doing the same operation on an automobile assembly line every 45 seconds is not ennobling. They may be necessary. I doubt it right now. They may be necessary, but one's attitude should not be to praise that kind of work, but rather to abolish it and liberate the people now condemned to it, to find more useful pursuits for them and for society. So I would criticize the Nixon basic philosophy in that it's terribly old-fashioned. In an era of revolutionary technology, to praise sweat is an anachronism. We should seek to liberate people from miserable and routine tasks so that they can be more human. We should tolerate those tasks only when they are absolutely necessary. That's a general thought. But secondly, to move now to the counterposition that Nixon makes in dealing with the issue of work, a counterposition which is not without its politics. For he seeks by this counterposition to reach out for the Republican Party to the American workers who have been Democrats, certainly since Franklin Roosevelt and perhaps since Woodrow Wilson. Now, what Nixon said in his message is, we have two ethics in America, the work ethic and the welfare ethic. And in saying that, he plays on some of the most ignorant prejudices in the land. For the clear implication of that Labor Day message of the President and of so much that he has said on this subject, the clear implication is that the poor are a bunch of lazy, loafing chiselers who don't like to work. And that's what millions of Americans think is the reality. And it is not. And maybe an American who is not the President and does not have the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at his beck and call, maybe such an American can believe in that myth, but the President should not, because I think he knows it's not true. The fact of the matter, and let me deal with some of the facts, the fact of the matter, first of all, and I suspect this might come as a shock to some of you, only about half of the people who are poor in the United States receive welfare at all. Let me repeat that. Only about half of the people who are poor get any welfare payment whatsoever. There are millions of poor people who do not get a nickel or a penny. There are millions of children who are poor and do not get a nickel or a penny. Indeed, until a few years ago, 2/3 of the poor didn't get a cent. One of the main reasons why the welfare rolls have increased has been that people who all along should have received welfare, who had a legal right to receive welfare, were not getting it. And that some of them, a few more, finally claimed the right that had theoretically been theirs all along. So first of all, to be poor and to be on welfare is not the same thing. About half of the people who are poor are not on welfare at all. Secondly, are the poor a bunch of loafers, a bunch of chiselers? The fact of the matter is, as the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare has said so many times, even during the Nixon presidency, there are practically no able-bodied males on welfare at all. Indeed, 1/3 of the families of the poor are headed by full-time working males. The outrage in this country is not that there are loafers on welfare, but that there are people who work all year long and don't get a wage sufficient to allow them to raise their families in any kind of decent circumstance. Welfare is not filled with able-bodied males. They don't exist there, or they hardly exist. Welfare is primarily aging people, children, and extremely handicapped people. Well, if that's the case, how then can one counterpose the work ethic and the welfare ethic when the overwhelming majority of the people on welfare can't work? It is, I suggest to you, on the federal figures, on the figures of Mr. Nixon's own government, a phony issue. But thirdly, one talks about work, and it's wonderful, and it's ennobling, and it's good, says the President, and then until 1971, he vetoes every law passed by Congress to create jobs for people. You say work is great, but you refuse to create jobs. What does that mean when you then say that people should be forced by law to go out and get a job? I will translate that to you into simple English. It means that you are forcing them into a menial, underpaid poverty labor market. It means that you're going to use the coercive power of the federal government to make people do not well-paying things, not useful things, but the dirtiest and most menial jobs in the society. And indeed, if you look at this work-welfare counterposition, you then have to ask yourself why it is under this administration, under the Nixon administration, that unemployment has doubled. That the number of people who had fought their way out of poverty under the Kennedy-Johnson administration, a number of them are now forced back down into poverty under the Nixon administration, which talks and talks and talks about work and vetoes job creation laws and follows policies which create high unemployment. And I'm suggesting that if you analyze that social reality, if you go behind the myths, the ugly myths, the ignorant myths, the prejudices, which the president is trying to stir up, you'll find that things are not at all as he suggests. Now, at this point, lest you think I'm unfair, let me say a kind word for Mr. Nixon. Treasure the moment. It will be the only kind word I will say for him this evening, I think. But I will say a kind word. Nixon's welfare reform proposal is the most radical social innovation that's been proposed in this society since the New Deal. It's the first new principle that's been proposed in this idea since the New Deal. It's so good, Nixon can't call it by its right name. It is a guaranteed annual income. Since the president campaigned against the guaranteed annual income in 1968, he has to deny when he proposes one that that's what he's proposing. It is, and he deserves enormous credit for having done so. Having paid my tribute to the president, let me now return to a more critical vein. When he proposed it, it was fascinating. He proposed it in the summer of 1969 with a marvelously conservative introduction. He said, the problem of welfare in the United States is that we have been centralizing everything in this rapacious bureaucracy that's located in Washington, and what we need are states' rights. It's good, solid, received conservative doctrine. And he then proposed to nationalize the welfare system. To his credit. To his credit. But there is a certain contradiction between saying the problem is we have too much centralization and then proposing a law which would require by federal fiat the state of Mississippi to increase its welfare benefits 500%. I'm happy that he did, but I don't think it exactly accords with what he said he was doing. Moreover, the Nixon proposal suggests that we institutionalize poverty well below the poverty line, just as we have a minimum wage that can make a man poor. Can you imagine? The richest society in the history of mankind has a legal minimum wage in which a man can be poor, and millions of workers who are outside the minimum wage altogether. And now, to add to that irony, we have the further irony that we're proposing a minimum national guaranteed annual income which is well below the poverty line. The benefits are terrible, and it has this work requirement, this compulsory work requirement, which is simply a way to force mothers with poor kids into the menial labor market. When you talk about putting those poor people to work, getting those loafers and spivs and chiselers to work, that's what you're talking about, forcing mothers to work. Forcing welfare mothers to work. They're the only population in the welfare system who are going to be affected by that at all. This involves, I should say to the women in the audience, a certain amount of male chauvinism among its other features. Male chauvinism in this sense. In economics and statistics in the United States, if you are a housekeeper and you are being paid for taking care of the house, you are working. But if you marry your employer, you diminish the gross national product, because according to our statistics, the work of a married woman is a joy. It is not productive, and therefore we are going to take these welfare mothers who are living it up, taking care of their children, and force them to work taking care of somebody else's children. And that's what a great deal of this scheme amounts to. What I think we have to do, I happen to believe in work, if you allow me to define it, and I would define it not quite so narrowly as Mr. Nixon. What we really have to do is to attack the outrageous unemployment that we have in this society, create jobs for everyone, useful jobs for themselves and for the society, and in that way liberate all those poor working people from poverty, and provide for those people who are poor and who cannot work a guaranteed annual income. So I'm saying, number one, that I find in this year's Labor Day message by Mr. Nixon, as in all of his previous Labor Day messages, in his pursuit of the Protestant ethic, the encouragement of a terrible, ugly, and untrue myth about the poor in America, that they're lazy, that they're freeloading, that they're having a great time on welfare. I find within it a callous disregard for job creation while you talk about work. I find in it a proposal essentially aimed at forcing poor and generally uneducated mothers out into the menial labor market. Now, secondly, let me turn now to the welfare system for the rich. It is really princely. It is the kind of a welfare system which, if we had it for the poor, it would be denounced in America as Bolshevism. What I'm going to say might come as a surprise to some of you. Therefore, I want to give you a source where you can check out my figures. And the source is the hearings of the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress this year, particularly the hearings last winter, at which testimony was taken from Joseph Peckman of the Brookings Institution, perhaps the foremost tax authority in the United States, Stanley Surrey, a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under the Johnson administration, and Philip Stern, another expert on tax matters. The figures will largely come from Peckman and Surrey and Stern. The analysis and the commentary will be my own. And what you have to understand is that our welfare state exists within an economy and society of extreme income inequality, and that at every point in the United States, the welfare state does more for the rich than for the poor, at every point. And I'll only name a few of the points, but in the question period, if somebody wants to name me a department of government, I think I can spell out how in that department, as well as those I will cite, you have more for the rich than for the poor. Let me give you a couple of examples. Take the Internal Revenue Code. The Internal Revenue Code is a profound social document, written in language guaranteed to be inexplicable to the ordinary citizen or the ordinary accountant or lawyer. And that's why we don't know what's going on there. It is a system of subsidies to rich people, because most of the big deductions in the Internal Revenue Code go to the rich. What we say is this. We say anybody who builds a mansion can get a tax deduction on the interest on the mortgage payment. All rich people who build mansions and all poor people who build mansions can get the same tax deduction. It is completely democratic and thoroughly discriminatory and class-oriented. Let me spell out what some of these benefits are. A worker who works in that Vega plant out in Ohio, where they've had the speed up and the young workers resisting the speed up. A worker who works making automobiles is taxed at the top bracket, the top level of the income tax that he owes. A person who does nothing but holds automobile stock for 6 months and sells it for a profit is forgiven any tax on half the profit and taxed at a special low rate on that part which is taxable. That is to say, it is the priority of the Internal Revenue Code that the activity of making automobiles is less worthy of public support than the activity of selling automobile stock. Now, lest you think, as John Conley and others want you very much to think, that trading in automobile stock is creating capital which the automobile companies are using to create new jobs which are putting people to work, lest you think that, you have to understand that most transactions on Wall Street have the redeeming social importance of a crap game. That is to say, that money that gets traded is not in general new money. When Ford stock or GM stock is sold, that doesn't mean Ford or GM gets money. It simply means that the people who are playing the game see who made the most money. Where most American business raises its capital is from retained profits, institutional investors, and the federal government, which in many cases provides most generous loans to private business. Therefore, we have this priority. Selling automobile stock, which has no economic function whatsoever in creating jobs, is more important than making cars, and that one little item is a welfare system worth $14 billion a year. $14 billion a year. What would happen if somebody would propose for the Office of Economic Opportunity? $14 billion. That would be regarded as radicalism. But $14 billion primarily going to very wealthy speculators in stock is right now part of our law. Or take another example, housing. We have over $12 billion worth of federal subsidy in housing, almost all of it going to the wrong people. The amount of money that we spend on low-cost housing for the poor is a joke compared to that $12 billion. We don't spend $1 billion a year. And who gets the $12 billion? Some of it, by the way, it's the forms in which the primary forms which it takes are, you get to deduct the interest on your mortgage payment from your taxes. You get to deduct your local property taxes. And if you own a house, you are not taxed on the rental value of the house. That adds up to about $12 billion a year of subsidy for these people. Who gets it? A small part of it goes to working people who own little houses, who are struggling for their own houses. And I'm not against that. But consider this. If you have a $25,000 house, that tax deduction is very small. And if you have a $200,000 house, it's very great. That is to say, those deductions, like all of the deductions in the Internal Revenue Code, operate in inverse relationship to need. The wealthiest man with the biggest house gets the greatest subsidy from the United States government for housing. The working person with a small bungalow gets a pittance. The renter gets zero. And the poor get a well-advertised little sum for low-income housing. And the result is that wealthy people drive by a housing project and they say to themselves, thank God that we are self-reliant and Emersonian and we are not on the dole. And the fact of the matter is that suburbia has got so much better a welfare system than the slums and ghettos of the United States that there's just no comparison between the two. Or take a question that perhaps might have some relevance in this state. Farm subsidies. And consider the fact that James O. Eastland is an impartial plantation owner who sits on the Senate Agricultural Committee and objectively helps fix the welfare payments he receives for not growing cotton in Sunflower County, Mississippi. He gets more than $100,000 a year for not growing cotton. And one of the consequences of that, those subsidies which have not gone basically to family farmers, which have certainly not gone to subsistence farmers who don't get a nickel because all these subsidies are geared to cash crops, one of the results of this has been that Eastland and his similars, particularly in the South, have been able to sustain a rate of mechanization and automation twice that of American industry and drive people out of the fields of the South into the cities of the North. And if you want to know in New York what is a good part of our welfare problem and a good part of our race problem and a good part of all our problems, it is that we have had at federal expense these problems exported from Mississippi, exported to all of the cities of the United States. So you have a system whereby individuals gain enormously and the society loses enormously. in which we use federal payments to socialize federal problems. Take the question of housing. In housing, George Romney was probably one of the best and most conscientious and idealistic of the Nixon cabinet members and is about to leave, therefore. George Romney has tried to do something. So we have a program to allow poor people to buy houses. Federal government's finally going to come in with a few bucks for that. But what happens? Unscrupulous speculators come in and buy lousy, run-down houses, patch them together, sell them to poor people whom they sometimes trick into buying them, who do not have the possibility of maintaining the house under this program, and the house begins to fall down on their heads, which could be foreseen by any intelligent person, and it proves to all the opponents of welfare that you can't trust the poor. The program was in the housing code called 235, the 235 program, and during the credit crunch, which reduced housing in America tremendously, the private sector stayed alive by profiteering on the poor. And the slogan of the private sector was, "Stay alive with 235." We live in a society where programs designed by idealistic people to aid the poor are used to make some people rich. And I'm saying this happens at every level of the society. Indeed, this morning in the Wall Street Journal there was a particularly sad editorial. The Wall Street Journal, I should say, before I criticize its editorial policy, is indispensable reading for any opponent of capitalism. It is a very honest newspaper. And as a matter of fact, in one of my books, Toward a Democratic Left, I put an acknowledgement in, praising the Wall Street Journal for all the information that it gave me and enabling me to attack the economic system in the United States. And strangely enough, they have never used it in any of their advertising. So when I criticize the Wall Street Journal, it's from a feeling that it's an honest, wrong paper, not an evil one. The Wall Street Journal this morning said, well, Romney is going, and he's a nice guy, but the poor fella, he really believed that the federal government had a responsibility to do something about the central cities. And really, it is just inevitable that whenever the federal government tries to do something about the central cities, it's going to make them worse than when it started. And what we really have to realize is the way the problem is going to be solved is everybody's going to go out to suburbia, the central cities are going to rot, and then at some point, property in the central cities, since they've rotted so much, will become so cheap that people will want to come in from suburbia back to the central cities, and at that point we'll solve the problem. And that means that we are now talking about, again, ignoring the other America, again making the poor invisible, again turning our backs on the problem. So I'm saying as a second main point, the welfare system for the rich in the United States of America, just in the tax system, just in the Internal Revenue Code, costs $77 billion a year. $77 billion. And that kind of money, were we to enact a tax reform that Milton Friedman, the leading laissez-faire economist in the United States, and I agree on, we could save that money. Milton Friedman, really, to him belongs the honor of having proposed this excellent left-wing idea. He was the chief economic advisor to Barry Goldwater, but an interesting man. Milton Friedman said, all we have to do is amend the Internal Revenue Code in the following way, to say, the income on which you pay your income tax shall be equal to your income. And if you do that, $77 billion surface that have primarily been going to wealthy people. And there have been other subsidies in other ways. The American welfare system, the problem of poverty, is a problem of much too much welfare for the rich and not enough for the poor. Indeed, I have facetiously said at times, but I would settle for it, I don't want to treat the poor better than anybody else. All I want to do is treat them as well as the rich. If we did that in America, we would have no problem with poverty. Finally, How does one talk about politically going beyond these priorities, these unconscionable priorities? And here again, let me say that I'm not talking about electing McGovern, although I clearly think that would be the giant first step that we could take, and I hope to God we do take this November. But I want to talk it relates obviously to this campaign, and you can make the connections yourself. I want to talk about a longer range political strategy. I want to suggest some ideas which would be relevant even if the unthinkable happens and Nixon gets another 4 years. And the problem as I see it is this. The classic Marxist expectation that there would develop within capitalist society a single group, the proletariat, which would be driven by the conditions of its existence to a revolutionary politics, and which would evolve into a majority so that its victory would be simultaneously the victory of democracy, that expectation has been disappointed. There is no one group in American society, not the working class, not the poor, not the blacks, not the Chicanos, not the rest of the minorities, not the liberal and radical middle class, not the students, not the church. There is no one group that can transform the society. Therefore, if there is a possibility of changing these priorities, there has to be a coalition. There has to be an alliance of more than one group. And what I want to do now is very briefly try to sketch out an idea of what that coalition has to be, if there's ever to be a majority in America for progressive change. Number one, a coalition for progressive social change in this country must have as an essential and decisive element the American working class. By the American working class, I do not mean a revolutionary proletariat of the imagination in which bronzed workers are reading Lenin and Marx and just chafing at the bit to change the system. That class, of course, does not exist. By the American working class, I mean the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters, the UAW, the working people of America, not as they should be, but as they are, in their own particular wisdom. These people, I suggest to you, need change objectively and are a constituency of change for one basic reason: they don't have enough. It is a myth that this is an affluent society. This is a society in which a relatively tiny minority are affluent, in which a much larger minority are poor, and in which the majority of the society doesn't have enough to live by our standards comfortably and in security. We just received a report about a month ago from the Bureau of the Census that the median income in the United States, 50% of the people are above it, 50% are below it, is $10,300 for families. Yet, the Bureau of Labor Statistics computes that a modest but adequate budget for a family of four is about $11,000. That is to say, the average typical American family is up against it, particularly if they have children in college. The worker, and by the way, this is an aspect of working class life which many Americans ignore, he doesn't get merit increases. When you go and take a job in a plant, unless you're a very unusual guy and become a foreman or something like that, but the normal guy in a plant does not get an increase because of something he does. The boss just wants him to do that one operation and to do it well and to show up and not to be absent on too many Mondays and Fridays. That's the important thing. There are no merit increases. Therefore, for a young worker, a UAW salary when he's 20 and not married is pretty good. When he's 25 and just married, it's not bad. When he's 35 or 40 and he's got kids and he's trying to send them to college or the university, it's not enough. He is up against it. He is up against it so much that a serious illness can wipe him out economically. Therefore, in a general sense, workers in the United States have an objective stake in social change. And I think it's a stake which young workers are coming to realize more. It's an interesting thing about this revolt of the young workers against the assembly line. These were the young guys who were supposed to accept, because they hadn't been through the union struggles. They were supposed to be more moderate. They were not going to be like the veterans of the 30s, of the bitter class struggles. But what people forgot when they said that is those guys who came out of the 30s were so terrified of unemployment and depression that they didn't want to step out of line 1 inch. But a young worker who hasn't known a depression like that, and the boss tells him, you got to do this and we're going to speed up the line, he fights back. And I think, therefore, in the shop, on the job, there is a basis in the American working class for social change. Thirdly, I think you have to understand, and many students do not, that when it comes to domestic social legislation, when it comes to national health insurance, when it comes to a Social Security amendment, when it comes to a poverty bill, the most important political force taking the right side on those issues is the AFL-CIO, which, if you listen to some people, is a bunch of old fogies and reactionary and all that kind of stuff. Not true. Right now, the reason that we are debating national health insurance, about 100 years after Bismarck gave it to the German people, 75 years after Lloyd George gave it to the British, we're finally getting around to it. The reason we are is because of the American trade union movement, not because of the churches, the civil rights movement, the students, the peace movement, or anything like that. In saying this, I should make it clear that I obviously disagree profoundly with George Meany and the official AFL-CIO position on Vietnam, and even more profoundly on the fact that Meany, who was so terrific in denouncing Nixon's wage price freeze for the bonanza for corporations and the squeeze for workers that it was, that Meany should take an attitude of neutrality about whether Richard Nixon's going to be president again. I hope he changes his mind. But even though I have those very serious disagreements, it seems to me that the workers, the organized workers, are a crucial, indispensable element of a coalition that can change the kind of skewed and terrible priorities I was talking about before. But, and here's where some of you come in, but there's obviously a conflict, a problem over style, over issues like smoking grass, over questions like abortion, over the length of one's hair, over beards, between this trade union movement, or at least some members of it. I think the older members of it. I notice that young workers, it seems to me, are getting hair just as long as college students these days. There is a conflict between part of that constituency and an extremely important new constituency, which a good number of you belong to. This new constituency that I am talking about is not the youth constituency. Youth is not a sociological or political category. There's been youth from the beginning of time, since Cain and Abel. Youth is a biological category. But youth changes its meaning as society develops. As Kenneth Keniston has pointed out, it was really capitalism and the middle class which invented adolescence. Prior to capitalism, you didn't have adolescence. You didn't have people being allowed not to work until they were 19, 20, 21, 22 years of age. That was something that could only happen at a certain level of society, a certain level of economic and cultural and political development. And now we're having in the United States, as Keniston has argued, due to our technology, due to our changing society, another new category being invented called youth, which lasts from about 20 to 30. It's possible, particularly if you've got a good graduate program, to stay out of the labor market for quite a while in this society. This is related to profound changes in the society, a much more technological and scientific society, a society which is wasting all kinds of money on education, which is nothing more than status certification, but which is also required to invest money in education, which is the preparation of skills to run this society. And therefore you have now almost half of the available generation going to some kind of college. That's a tremendous change. It's a change, not just a biological change about young people, it's a change in the class structure of the society. And it's created a new constituency, which was obvious in the McCarthy and Kennedy campaigns of '68, and the Vietnam moratorium, and in the McGovern campaign of '72, quite obvious. And that constituency, as a recent study by the Yankelovich polling organization indicated, is huge. It runs into the millions. There are millions of young people in college who are dissatisfied with some of the fundamental values of this society. Coming out here today on the plane, I was reading the Reader's Digest about how young people are unhappy about corporations and business, which delighted me. This stratum, or these strata, because there are a great many groups involved, these strata, it seems to me, have an enormous possibility for the good and an enormous possibility for the bad. Let me take the bad possibility first. If this new movement, which appears as a youth movement, but is something else, an issue-oriented, college-educated mass constituency, if this new constituency self-righteously decides to write the perfect program and to maximize its own righteous wisdom, it can split itself off from the working people and the minorities and everybody else in the society and absolutely guarantee the domination of the Republican Party for the next generation. Kevin Phillips, the writer who was some people regard as the theorist of Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968, is absolutely salivating over this possibility that a young, elitist, college-educated, self-important, and self-righteous movement will come along and destroy the Democratic Party. And I think it's a possibility. But the good possibility is if this new constituency understands its own power, its own role, the value of the education and the privilege it has received, but takes that and links it up with working people, with trade union people, with black people, with Chicanos, with farmers, with ordinary people who haven't had the advantage of a college education. If that happens, and I hope to God it happens between now and November, I think there is an enormous positive potential here. Thirdly, there are the poor and the minorities. And here let me again be negative first. If all of the poor registered to vote, which they will not, because the conditions of their existence are such that it does not make for great public participation. Being poor is pretty miserable. You often don't have the time and the energy to vote. You often don't have a stable enough address to vote, particularly since our registration procedures are usually designed to keep as many poor people off the rolls as possible. The poor, if all of the poor got together, they would not be a majority. If all of the minorities got together, they would not be a majority. There was a meeting just the other day down in Texas of a Chicano political party, La Raza Unida, and trying to stake out for Chicanos in national American politics a third role. They can't play it. There are not enough of them. That's the brutal fact. There's not enough of anybody to go it alone. Everybody's got to get it together, including the poor and the minorities. Having said that, it's obvious that some of the most important insurgencies of this society have come from the poor and the minorities in recent years, from movements like Martin Luther King's movement, from Cesar Chavez, from the National Welfare Rights Organization, from the American Indians, and from so many other groups. But there has to be coalition. These groups have to come together. Finally, in terms of this political analysis, it seems to me that the only hope for these changes is if the Democratic Party is the arena and focus for action. I wish that we could plant a new banner, write a new program, invite the masses to leave both the Democratic and the Republican parties and follow us. Those who agree with what I'm saying. Only problem is, I'm the national co-chairman of the Socialist Party of the United States. We tried it 50 years ago, and believe me, it didn't work. For reasons which are too complex to enter in here, it doesn't work. Right now, the mass of Americans who need social change insofar as they are politically mobilized or mobilized in the Democratic Party. Right now, the basic choice in this society, you could say, would that it were otherwise. I agree. But it is not otherwise. The basic choice is between Nixon and McGovern. And without getting too fanatic about it, he who was not for McGovern is for Nixon. I'm afraid I think that's the way it is lining up. And therefore, what we have to do, it seems to me, is not create a third party de novo, but create a first party within the Democratic Party. Transform an old party into a new party. And I think of the Democratic Convention in 1972. One saw absolutely fantastic strides in that direction. If this campaign of 72 and beyond 72 can follow the kind of analysis that I'm presenting, I hope, if you can bring together trade unionists and these new strata of the issue-oriented, college-educated, the poor and the minorities, all these people who need change, then I think the Democratic Party can become a new party in everything but name, and I don't care about the name. So if I can summarize what I've been trying to say this evening. Number one, about the politics of poverty. The welfare program for the poor is not the kind of welfare program at which the president slyly hints in his counterposition of the work and welfare ethic. It is a welfare program that does not embrace the majority of the poor. It is a welfare program primarily for people who cannot work, and the proposals to force people to work are really proposals to force mothers out into a menial job market with the coercive power of the United States government. Secondly, if the welfare program in the United States for the poor is miserable and utterly inadequate, the welfare program for the rich is terrific. It's got, just in its tax subsidies, $77 billion, a welfare program that makes any kind of welfare program for the poor look like nothing. It's got $77 billion of tax subsidies, and indeed every federal program becomes primarily a source of the profit of the rich and only incidentally a service to the poor. And I think that will be true until we begin to change some of the very fundamental inequalities of the American income structure. And finally, I'm saying that we need a political strategy, not just for 72, but indeed for 72, of building a coalition of working people and these new strata and the poor and the minorities. And what I'm saying in summary is not to ask you kind and benevolent people to do something nice for the poor. I wish you would do that too, but not to ask you to do that. But to ask all kinds of Americans to organize and to deal with the problem of poverty, and in dealing with the problem of poverty, to deal with the priorities of the entire society, and not simply abolish poverty, which we must do, but also create a better United States of America for all of us. Thank you.
Mr. Harrington has consented for a brief question and answer session. If you will please state your questions as loudly as possible so we can hear them and repeat them for the rest of the audience.
The question is, considering that I understand the need for a majority party in coalition politics, why do I remain a socialist? Basically because I think I can separate out two things, although it's very difficult and dangerous. I can separate out the fact that I think we need in this country and in this world basic and fundamental change. I think we need the democratization of economic power under capitalism and under communism. I think we need the democratization of the corporations and of the commissars. I think that's a basic need of our age. If I could put it in the philosophical framework, I would say that it seems to me that the fundamental trend of the late 20th century is toward collectivism. And that what we have in Richard Nixon, an American conservative, is not free enterprise or classic conservatism, but corporate collectivism. Collectivism for the rich. That I think that the basic options before the world are corporate collectivism as under Nixon, totalitarian collectivism as under Brezhnev and Mao, or the possibility of a democratic collectivism, of a humane and libertarian collectivism, which I call socialism. Therefore, I want to constantly say to people, what is necessary is not merely this or that increment. What is necessary is a basic change. I want to say, as long as we leave the economy as fundamentally maldistributed in wealth and economic power as it now is, every time the liberals and reformers get power and try to do something, that huge system of wealth and concentrated economic power will just squeeze you to death and will wind up working to the benefit of the rich more than to that of the poor. Therefore, I think we need fundamental change. At the same time, I want to affect American life as it is. I want to make the next step. I want to take the first step on the voyage of 1,000 miles. I do not see in America, and I think anybody who does is, to use a kind word, crazy, a revolutionary situation. I don't see the prospect of a sudden surge of mass consciousness and an October revolution in which we seize the Winter Palace, wherever that is in Washington, D.C. But I think that it's going to be a much more complicated transition than we had dreamed. Therefore, I want to take this vision of the needs of the 21st century and try to apply it to 1972. I think the great danger for the radical thinker, the two great dangers, are that you get so visionary as to become irrelevant, or so relevant as to become unvisionary. And the tightrope that I have chosen to walk, and that I hope more people would walk in this society, is to try to be both relevant and visionary at the same time. It's a very uncomfortable job, but I think one has to be in America, and I wish more people were, a socialist in vision, and in terms of practical politics, a supporter of liberalism against conservatism, because that's the mass option. There are some, yeah? The question is, what prospects are there for this kind of coalition politics among the rank and file of union workers? Yeah. I would say two things in response to that. Number one, this is September. I would remind you of September 1968. In September 1968, there were all kinds of guys in the UAW shops in Michigan who were for Wallace. All kinds of other guys who were for Wallace. That Wallace vote was cut in half in terms of the polls and the reality, because as November came nearer and nearer, an awful lot of workers said, gee, I may have this or that feeling about black people, or about poor people, or about busing, or about welfare chiseling. But really the most fundamental and important thing to me is my job, and if this Nixon guy gets in, unemployment's going to go up. It turned out to be scientifically accurate. So that when the guy got into the polling booth, so to speak, if he had race prejudice or if he had some other suspicions, they became less important than his class interest in a full employment economy. I hope that'll work right now. I also think, and I hope that McGovern emphasizes this, that the McGovern message on tax reform is not only good, true, and just, but it's smart politics. Because I don't think that the American working class is getting anything more than a couple of nickels and dimes out of that $14 billion worth of capital gains deductions. And I think when McGovern says we should have a tax system in which there will be no increase on taxes on incomes received through work, but only increases of taxes on incomes received not through work, he has got, I think, a very powerful idea whose time has come. And that $77 billion is there. Now, McGovern's not going to go the whole hog I would go and say, let's take the whole $77 billion back. But for openers, if you took $20 billion back, you could do some interesting things in this society. So finally, let me concede what you're saying. I don't want to paint a rosy picture. I think that there are contrary tendencies to my desires among American working people, related to issues like race, busing, crime in the streets, some myths about welfare that lots of working people believe and that Nixon is trying to encourage with every resource at his command. So maybe I'm wrong, but I certainly think there's a fight to be made, and I think even between now and November, if the American trade unionists realize their real interest, I think they might come around. Last point, and I'll stop rambling on this, just I think yesterday, the day before yesterday, the International Association of Machinists at a convention endorsed McGovern by a wildly enthusiastic voice vote. And it's interesting to remember that during the primaries, the IAM supported Henry Jackson. And I think these guys know when push comes to shove, maybe they wanted Jackson and higher defense spending because lots of IAM guys are in defense and aerospace. But when push comes to shove, they know the difference between Nixon and McGovern. I hope most workers will. Yeah?